The bland numbers represented people, catalogued and filed and with bureaucratic diligence updated by the RCMP security service for decades. In Ontario alone, the lists in 1953 included more than 2,000 men and women either approved or awaiting approval for internment in a time of crisis. In Manitoba, one of 600 targeted subversives was this man, Jacob Penner, a prominent city politician in Winnipeg who also happened to be a longtime communist. Jake Penner was a founder of the Communist Party of Canada. Sat on city council for nearly 30 years. His life was an open book. And still, for most of it, he was spied upon as a subversive. It started as far back as 1919 when he lived here. He had frequent visits from a man he believed to be a friend and a fellow socialist. Jake once told the so-called friend he knew that he was being spied upon. "I know a spy when I see one," he claimed. Obviously not. The friend, codenamed Agent 50, was in fact a spy for the police. In the 1940s, policemen would raid the Penner home.
I don't know what the heck they were looking for, dangerous literature. They wouldn't know dangerous literature if it hit them on the head.
Roland Penner is Jacob Penner's son.
Was he a dangerous man?
No, absolutely not. You know, he had the slightest intention, either singly or jointly with others, of overthrowing the state by force and violence. That wasn't his character, that wasn't his mode, that wasn't his belief.
Roland Penner followed his parents' political footsteps, became a leading communist in Manitoba, and like his parents, a subject of intense police surveillance. He'd later discover just how intense when he got to see his security files.
You have got a fairly voluminous file delivered to you, and you mentioned 80% of it is blacked out. Any way of figuring out what it is they didn't?
Well, yeah, it's all the stuff that would tell me or anybody else who the informants were. That's what that's all about.
Have you any idea who the informants were?
I have some ideas, none that I can state here publicly because they're only impressions, inferences.
In the dossier, is there any reference to something called Profunc, P-R-O-F-U-N-C?
I don't even know what that means.
So we told him, based on documents we've been able to access. In the event of a perceived national emergency, there would have been a call to police detachments all across the country. It would signal the beginning of what they called M-Day, Profunc Mobilization Day, the beginning of a massive roundup of political activists.
Attention all detachments. Attention all detachments. This is a level 1 emergency.
Immediate red Profunc at 0600 hours, June 2nd. Repeat. Immediate red
Profunc at 0600 hours, June 2nd.
Police commanders had secret briefings to prepare for M-Day. At each detachment, sealed envelopes, procedures to be followed, and the names of people to be picked up and detained. The orders were impressive for their bureaucratic detail. We now know those secret envelopes were thick with forms they blandly called C-215s, arrest documents called apprehension orders, precise details on specific targets, their ages, photographs, physical descriptions, information about their cars and their houses, with particular attention to potential exits for escape. There were obviously thousands of them. Among them, this C-215 document authorizing the arrest of Jacob Penner, an elected city councillor in Winnipeg for 27 years. There was a separate order for his wife, Rose Penner. When we come back, questions about how far the long arm of Profunc extended. They were called the Profunc Files. secret dossiers on citizens considered risks to national security dating back to 1950. It was still an active part of the security apparatus in 1968, when, according to this document, an advisory committee on internments was still reviewing Profunc files. Files that may well have included one of the most influential politicians in the history of Canada.
In a Medicare program, inadequate health services for every man, woman, and child, irrespective of their income, their age, or their physical condition.
Tommy Douglas, former Premier of Saskatchewan, the father of public health care, and eventually this.
The greatest Canadian as decided by you is...
Tommy!
But as a tireless advocate for social reform, Douglas was a likely target for a different kind of recognition. Security surveillance. What the Mounties might have learned, we can't confirm. Nearly 25 years after his death, much of his security file remains off limits.
Jerusalem.
What is available confirms that the Mounties spied on Tommy Douglas for more than 30 years, with particular attention to connections to the peace movement and the Communist Party. Was he one of thousands of Canadians who were deemed worthy of internment in the event of international hostilities? We may never know for sure. The present-day security establishment is insisting that most of Tommy Douglas' files remain secret indefinitely. Secrecy, they say, is intrinsic to security matters. But we've been able to come up with one tantalizing document, an intelligence report based on a 1954 newspaper story with this handwritten reference, C-215. We know that C-215 refers to a detention order, a key part of Ottawa's internment plan for arresting communist sympathizers. And one of the names underlined in this supposedly incriminating document is that of Tommy Douglas. Maybe inconclusive evidence. But in another file, on another subject of police surveillance, an identical marginal reference led us to confirm the existence of an apprehension order for Roland Penner, the son of Jacob and Ruth Penner, who were also targets for possible internment. Roland Penner, like his parents, was a communist, ran for election in the 50s, which earned him his own C-215 detention document that was regularly updated for at least 20 years. Roland Penner would later join the NDP, and when the party formed the government of Manitoba in the 80s, he'd be sworn in to serve as Attorney General of the province.
I'm sitting in front of the former Attorney General of the province, and I have in my lap draft detention orders for you, your first wife, possibly your children, parents. Draft detention orders that were constantly updated. How long do you think the active surveillance of you by the Mounties continued?
I've reason to believe, and I say that without being able to do anything more than make an inference from the dossier, that it continued even when I was Attorney General. Now, when it stopped, I don't know.
Does the dossier...
Lyndon, I have to advise you, it may not be stopped now. You may be under surveillance yourself.
From a security perspective, Jim Laxer, like Roland Penner, might also have been dangerous. He grew up in a dangerous environment, under the influence of committed communists.
Morning.
Laxer and Penner met for the first time recently to compare experiences living in the shadow of internment.
You look like your father.
And you look like your brother.
They knew nothing about Profunc until we showed them documents outlining plans for the pickup and detention of individuals like them.
Now, Manitoba, you had 161 RT men. That's, you know, enough evidence for pickup. And for women, you had 37, sufficient evidence for pickup. So this is so clearly, I mean, the thing is aimed right at us. I mean, this is Manitoba, Winnipeg is aimed at you, and Ontario, Toronto is aimed at my family.
Police, open the door! Police, ouvrez la porte!
Based on the explicit details of the documents, we can credibly imagine what could have happened. The precise instructions for the raids and the arrests. What is truly shocking is how much we learn from the particulars of how prospective internees would be treated. They'd be under military control, subject to stringent regulations, not allowed to speak to one another without permission from their guards. Page after page of rules with harsh consequences for infractions. Up to 3 days on a bread and water diet. And should they try to leave, they could be shot. Times change. Our insecurities evolve. By the 70s, the bogeyman of communism was replaced by the specter of homegrown terrorism. The October crisis in Quebec in 1970 provokes another startling authoritarian display.
At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that? Oh, just watch me.
Under the War Measures Act, nearly 500 people are swiftly rounded up from lists provided by the security establishment. Jean-Paul Brodeur took part in a subsequent review of police activity during the crisis in Quebec. Before he died recently, he confirmed for Radio-Canada that some arrests in October 1970 were based on lists of communists, possibly those Profunc lists, made available to Quebec police.
Ils sont mis en contact avec la GRC et ils ont été au quartier général de la GRC à cette époque-là, qui était rue Sainte-Catherine. Ils étaient dans une petite pièce et les gens de la GRC allaient dans une autre pièce et revenaient avec des dossiers qu'ils ne leur donnaient pas vraiment à lire, mais leur donnaient des noms.
It would come as a surprise to Daniel Waterloo to find himself among the separatists.
Tiens, je suis ici.
Waterloo was definitely an old-school communist, an admirer of international revolutionaries, Lenin, Che Guevara. But he had no sympathy for terrorism.
The FLQ, we didn't agree with bombings. It's not the way to change the world. And our principle is of changing society with the people, not against the people. If you blow bombs and you kill the neighbor's daughter, you're not going to have the woman to support your activity. It's not right. It's not the correct way.
But Waterloo was swept up anyway, spent months in jail and never quite knew why, until now. We've been able to confirm for him that he'd been a long-standing candidate for internment under the Profunc operation. Daniel Waterloo was one of those thousands of Canadians for whom an apprehension order, a C-215, had been prepared and filed away for use in an emergency. Radicals, whatever cause they advocate, end up on lists. Secret lists are among the basic building blocks of national security. The trouble with lists is that the people who end up on them rarely know about them, or what the people who record their names ultimately do with them, who they share them with. And we can never know for sure what impact being on a list might have on a life or on a livelihood. There was little doubt back in the 60s that Martin Loney would end up on a list. He was a student radical in British Columbia. Even when he later took a job in government, he wound up on another list, as he recently discovered.
Of more concern, however, is the presence within certain government departments and agencies, particularly CMHC, of a small group of former campus revolutionaries. This group was led until recently by Martin Loney.
This is a letter from a minister, prepared with input from the RCMP.
Loney has returned to the United Kingdom to accept a teaching position, but his disciples remain. This is deranged nonsense. I mean, the idea that people would be my disciples